Hello and welcome to an Infinity the Game faction focus for the Morat Aggression Force. In this video, we're talking about who Morats are, how they play, what are their strengths, weaknesses, and faction identity, before jumping into Infinity Army to go through many, not all, but many of the profiles that showcase that faction identity and how Morats play. Now, Morats are a faction in a very interesting spot in N5 because their identity has more or less translated wholesale from N4, but with some very key changes, not just to the faction, but to the rules that underpin the faction, that have had some significant effects in terms of making Morats' strengths stronger, but also their weaknesses more pronounced. Now, the good news is that the list of strengths for this faction is really, really long. I am going to have a lot of good things to say about the Morat Aggression Force, but it is worth noting that that comes with some significant trade-offs. And so when we kind of tie the faction together at the end of this introductory section, what we're going to see is that wonderful example of a faction that accepts some significant constraints in order to do things that just almost no other faction in the game can do. And that's really cool and interesting and positions Morats in a really unique space, which is exactly what you want from an army, particularly a sectoral in a faction like Combined Army, which offers so much variety to its players. So, strengths of the Morat Aggression Force to begin with, where we really have to start by talking about, unsurprisingly, the Warhorse rule, because Warhorse is a rule that has changed in N4 and which Morats have the most access to of any faction in the game. Any trooper in the Morat Aggression Force that is a Morat will have the Warhorse rule and the Religious Troop rule, and Warhorse, formerly Veteran, is a really good rule in N4. So what having the whole faction having access to Warhorse means is that, okay, there are a few small things. You will be mostly immune to loss of lieutenant. There is no need for chain of command in this faction. Your army will just fight on through a disruption in your command chain without any concerns. Your remotes will become irregular, but otherwise your whole army will just keep generating regular orders, which means you have the option, for example, of playing relatively aggressive lieutenant pieces. Your army is also going to be basically immune to the retreat state, which means in the unlikely event that an opponent's attack has rendered you really on the ropes in terms of just losing the attrition fight, it's very possible that you can muster a last turn attack or push to try and accomplish some objective that might actually win you the game. But those are the minor effects of Warhorse. Those are things that will come up very occasionally where you get to go, oh yeah, I'm just immune to this small thing that the game can inflict on me. The bigger things that Warhorse does and which really impact how Morats play, firstly are immune to isolation, and secondly immune to the Ballistic Skill attack -3 rule, and that bit is new in N5. Now, the effects of immunity to isolation have been one of the things that Morats have always had, and so to reiterate what I have said in previous faction focuses about the Morats, there are a bunch of small but really significant effects that add up a lot over the course of a game, thanks to being immune to isolation. You are mostly immune to the effects of electromagnetic weapons. Even your heavy infantry are only going to be immobilized by an electromagnetic hit, and an immobilization is an easy effect to reset out of, even with mediocre willpower. Your hackers are very good at bullying non-KHD hackers, because usually if a regular enemy hacker is trying to defend itself against one of your hackers, they will use the isolation program, Oblivion, because that's a program that would turn off your ability to continue to attack them, because the isolated state turns off hacking devices, but your hackers don't care about that. Your entire faction also just bullies whole factions in the game that are reliant on isolated states as part of their defensive mix. So things like Toha, for example, have Ferraware that they're a little bit reliant on as part of their defensive mix that Morats can just push through. Ghazi Matawiya in Hackerslam, or any faction that wants to use jammers, you get to almost completely ignore with Morats. And factions that rely on electromagnetic tools generally, like the new Imperial Service, who can have an army that just has multiple EM mines, multiple EM carbines, emitters, just tons of electromagnetic attacks in the list, well, the Morat Aggression Force is just a nightmare for them. Now, That's how Morats have always been able to play. It makes Morats a faction that are quite good at dealing with or punching down into asymmetric warfare lists, because things like hacking is less able to affect you. Things like electromagnetic attacks, which are the kind of thing that would be used by troops to try and disable heavy pieces. Your heavy pieces in Morats are very resistant to being disabled. Even a tag in Morats just doesn't hugely care about something like Miranda Ashcroft spooling up against it, for example. Yes, the immobilization state is an issue, but there's a very big difference between that, which you will reset out of on something like a 9, and being isolated and immobilized, which, if that could apply to a tag like a Raicho, would completely brick it. So you have all of these little multiplicative effects that in any given game are going to arise just as a result of the fact that this is a faction-wide rule. And now, in N5, we see the immunity to ballistic skill attack -3 round out what is kind of now a new part of the Morat aggression force identity. And that is Warhorse, in combination with plentiful access to visors, makes Morats into a faction that can kind of reliably ignore any negative modifier your opponent is hoping to impose on you. And so, genuinely and a little tongue-in-cheek, you might say that the new faction identity of Morats in N5 is to be the guy that gets to say, "That's a lot of words on your troop profile, too bad I'm not reading any of them." And so, to give an example just anecdotally, we've got a very good semi-local Nomads player who is in Canberra from time to time, very skilled, has won satellite tournaments, etc., who was experimenting with or doing their first games in with GoPods in N5. We were both at the local game night. I expressed an interest in having a game, and when I mentioned that I was playing Morats, I have never seen anyone dodge the hell out of a game than they did against me when I mentioned who I was playing. Now, I am sympathetic to that. If you are playing a model for the first time, like a GoPod, and you are excited for it, you don't want to play it into a faction that is just going to skeet shoot it out of the sky because they ignore every rule that it is completely reliant upon to get value. But that is the kind of thing that the Morat aggression force does. There are very common troop types and regiments and entire sectorals that look at Morats across the table, pinch the bridge of their nose, and go, that thing I was really excited about trying doesn't fucking work against you. Now, on top of all of that, there are a lot of general, solid, mechanical, infinity kind of stuff, strengths, that Morats also have access to, that are just nice, solid strengths. One thing is that apart from a bit of a lack in the marker state section, which we will talk about, Morats just have a really nice mix of differently costed troops. This is something that's kind of improved in a nice way as a result of balance updates in N5, where there are interesting and attractive options in almost all points bands across the faction, from the relatively expensive down to the very cheap. That's really nice just in terms of having compelling list building options, that you have cool 50-something point models, cool 30-something point models, cool 20-something point models, cool 15, 14 point models, cool 4-point models. That's just really nice from a list construction perspective. You've also got just good heavy infantry, but also good medium infantry and good warbands. And of course, you have the combined army remotes package, which we won't talk about when we go into the army section because it's ubiquitous across combined army. But just having access to the best baggage bot and the best total reaction bot in the game is really nice. Not only that, in N5, you've got access to even more hacking than you used to the point where Morats are now kind of easily and almost incidentally able to field a upper middle tier hacking army without actually putting any kind of imposition on the rest of their force. Many of the specialists that you will just go to because they are solid specialists are going to be hackers with pitchers in links, potentially with tin bots. And so a Morat force is able to just be a little bit of an incidental bully in the InfoWar space without really having to do any work for that, without having to compromise their lists. And then finally, we have the old standout since the N4 rework Morat Strengths, which is that you just have link teams for absolute days. It is not uncommon to have 9, 10, 11, 12, maybe even 14 linkable troops in a Morat Aggression Force list. And one of the really important things there is that those are not just like one big link team kind of setups. They are not inflexible. That is many small link teams. Morat Aggression Force can very comfortably have a 3-person core link and 2 3-person Haris teams and some duos and have all of those be viable offensive or support elements, making great use of at least the duo bonus for special die in ballistic skill attacks and AROs, but also just the order efficiency that comes from being able to move around like multiple troops at the same time as you're spending orders. And those like 3-man fire teams, maybe 4-man fire teams are the really sweet spot, because once you get very big fire teams, those can become challenging to move into the midfield and still have safe. It becomes risky to expose larger link teams to the risks that come from being forward positioned close to your opponent. But Morats being able to run multiple, like many 3 and 2-man teams, don't really suffer from that while having all of the benefits of cool link team play. Now, that's a really long list of really cool strengths, but it is balanced by some significant limitations. And the first of those, the most significant, is as a consequence of the change to how fire teams work in N5. As much as the Morat Aggression Force is a fantastic fire team faction, they are, because of how fire teams have changed, a very, very Ballistic Skill 12 and 13 faction. It is very rare in modern Morat lists to see even Ballistic Skill 14, and Ballistic Skill 15 is now effectively out of reach. Technically, it's possible to reach on a single trooper, but we're not using Cornac as a tip of the spear gunfighting piece. So Morats are going to have reasonably high burst, but low ballistic skill. And so we have to think about how we take gunfights, right? We ignore all of these enemy rules. We have visors to ignore mimetism. We have ballistic skill, Warhorse to ignore ballistic skill attack -3, and we will have some non-visor troops to engage enemies with albedo, which means we should be in a position where we can always roll using our baseline ballistic skill plus range minus cover, but we're going to be in a really bad spot if we can't do that. Anytime Morats get ranged in on where they're caught in a 0 or a -3 range band, the ballistic skill that we're working with just plummets, because ballistic skill 12 or 13 is really the floor in Infinity for what can conceivably be considered to constitute a good ballistic skill attack. And so you must, as Morats, play to your visors when visors are necessary, Warhorse when Warhorse is necessary. You have to use all of your tools to ignore enemy modifiers and impose your modifiers on the enemy in order to win gunfights, because you cannot just bull through off the back of a high ballistic skill score and high burst. Now, when we get to options in troops for like fireteam troops and linked troop gunfighters, that's one of the things that we'll talk about, how what I like to use as gunfighting troops in Morats has changed because our ballistic skill is more constrained with the removal of the really high ballistic skill bonuses from big core link teams, but it is really part of how Morats play and fight in N5, so it needs to be mentioned. There is also the old limitation in Morats, which has always been the case. Morats have nothing that represents a marker state. There is nothing that can deploy in camouflage, there is nothing that can deploy hidden, there is nothing even that can cyber mask. Morats always deploy with their hand face up. Your opponent always gets total information about what is going on in your force. If there are, for example, only 14 troops on the table, it means that your opponent knows with absolute certainty that you've either only chosen to play 14 troops or there is a drop troop coming. Now, that is something that you can use to your advantage to an extent. Playing 14 trooper Morat lists just to freak your opponent out is totally viable. But that near complete lack of access to a hidden information game is a constraint on Morats that other factions would not have to deal with. And finally, as a change from N4, in N4 I would have described Morats as a very high order count faction because of adaptations that at least I have had to make in my list construction to accommodate the needs of N4 in terms of what constitutes good gunfighters, what constitutes good specialists and good link teams, etc. I would say Morats now tend to work with a relatively average order count. We don't really exceed what other factions can do. We should generally be able to comfortably work with 15 regular orders, But for me at least, unless I am building a very specific list archetype, the days of very, very high order count lists are kind of over. That's fine from my perspective, but it is something when we look, for example, at the list that we'll showcase at the end of this video, we're going to see much more normal order counts, and that means that every casualty hurts proportionally a little bit more. Morats do have to be just kind of bloody-minded and efficient, use the link team movement efficiency to get good use out of our orders, use things like smoke shooting to have efficient gunfights, because it is quite easy to have a situation in Morats materialize where you've taken some casualties, your order count is a little bit lower, and because you are relying primarily on Ballistic Skill 12 and 13 troops, it can take longer than you would like to push through gunfights and suppress enemy ARO pieces. This means that, and this has kind of always been true, but even more so in N5, Morats are a faction that need to spend their orders judiciously, not just unga bunga forward, not just play mindlessly aggressively, but to pick their lines of advance, pick their fights, and play in a very focused kind of aggressive way in order to succeed. And so, in that spirit of focused judiciousness, we are going to jump straight into Infinity Army now, because we have an awful lot of profiles that we need to talk about, because the breadth of the Morat aggression force is even wider in N5 than it was in N4 in terms of viable and interesting profiles. Now, normally in these videos, I would start by talking about our baseline link team options, but the entire Morat aggression force is basically a link team option. But we will nevertheless start with the Morat link team. This is an almost completely ubiquitous polyvalent link. A huge portion of the faction can legally join this link and contribute to link bonuses, but despite that, I find it is still relatively common for me to run these just as duos or Haris teams or 3-person cores. You can go up to 4 if you want +1 ballistic skill, and that can be a good call, especially if you are trying to do an N4 style heavy infantry assault many orders fire team kind of list. That's very viable. You can basically build an old school invincible army style list that is better at close assault thanks to things like the Kaitox. But we will be going through all of the different options that you can play that are kind of within that scope of this is a good thing to add to the link. We won't cover everything that you can add to a Morat link, but we're going to start with Morat Vanguard Infantry. Now, in N4, there was maybe one Morat Vanguard infantry that you would ever use in a list, which was a Morat Vanguard Paramedic. Frankly, I wouldn't even use him now, but there is a very small amount of consideration to be given to the Vanguard Ballistic Skill Attack -3 Heavy Machine Gun. Now, I am not suggesting this is a particularly great gunfighter, but you can duo link one of these guys with something like a Datarazzi Cyber Combat Unit to have a relatively cheap Group 2 gunfighter. And if all you are looking to do is have an SWC cheap gun spray down enemy Thunderbolt total reaction bots, then this guy will efficiently do that job and then not a great deal else. Provided your opponent does not have Warhorse themselves, then 5 dice on 11s imposing a -3 is good enough to win some gunfights, and if all we are doing is looking to just get a duo bonus on a relatively cheap gunfighter and some secondary element, then that's probably fine. One of the very interesting things that the Morat Aggression Force can do in N5 is actually run with far more SWC flexibility than they used to have in N4. In N4, it was 1.5 SWC on every gun that you would ever take in the list basically for days, which constrained you pretty much to 3 SWC equivalent guns in a Morat list. That is not the case in N5. Now, we are going to see other better ways of getting SWC equivalent weapons into a list for cheap, but the heavy machine gun ballistic skill attack -3 Morat Vanguard is one of those options, and it is worth considering in occasional lists if you find that it's that 1 SWC and 23 points that are just what fits, maybe as a group 2 gunfighter with limited expectations. That's not a bad place for that kind of pace. Next up, and in my opinion a cornerstone of the faction, in N5 as it was in N4, but honestly more in N5 than it was in N4, the Dartok Cyber Combat Team. We are only interested in the FTO here, but 18 points gets you a linked pitcher, a Willpower 13 Warhorse BTS 3 Hacker, a hacker with Trinity, Trinity with improved damage. That is just really solid value, especially in a faction where you will always be able to link that picture, and if you want it, will always have easy access to the best baggage bot in the game. The Dartok is the core of the Morat Aggression Force's ability to just incidentally have upper middle tier hacking ability with basically no concessions made to the requirements of the list otherwise, and that is a really big deal. Now, these guys are not going to punch their way through the best hackers in the game. Something like an Anathematic is going to blow its way through these kind of guys, but of course it does. It is more than 3 times their cost. Anecdotally, though, I would say that outside of vanilla combined army, my experience has been that people are leaning more toward kind of just enough hacking in many of their lists. That may just be a local consideration, but my games with Morat Aggression Force have kind of shown that being in the upper mid tier of what is possible for hacking is actually sufficient to give you pretty solid hacking dominance in many games. Now, Willpower 13 is something that is going to let you down if you try and use these guys for much more than using Trinities through a repeater in your active turn. Trying to Spotlight, for example, as part of a guided missile play in active is usually going to feel very inefficient, and Morats are not necessarily a force that has the order count that they had in N4. But happily, that's not really a problem because all you need to do to make Dartox annoying is at some point during your turn fling out a picture or two, and then you can put multiple AROs through those repeaters as your opponent moves up to clear them. At which point, if you have parked yourself in zone of control of an Icadron, you can just reload and do it again next turn. Only 18 points means there is a limit on how much you can demand from a Dartok, but they are very, very good for the cost in the context of the faction. Next up, a piece that I use much less this edition, but which is still very good, the Kaitox Shock Regiment. Now, these are one of the few regiments in the Morat Aggression Force that have seen a contraction of their usefulness across editions. That is because of the change to how Frenzy and Link teams interact. It used to be that the fact that Link teams completely suppressed the Frenzy rule made any of the Kaitox profiles viable. These days I would be leaning toward basically only the Chain Rifle Flamen Spear profile as a tip of the spear assault kind of element. These guys want to be pushing forward, rounding a corner, engaging an enemy, and firing just either a ton of templates or a ton of dice with a heavy pistol into a dodging enemy. 19 points gets you very, very clean points trades with these kind of pieces if you deliver them, or the option to use them as defensive elements in kind of the same role, relying on their armor 5, multiple wounds, templates, etc. as ARO pieces. Now, if you have the SWC spare, I think you could still optionally take the heavy rocket launcher pistol +1 burst profile, but the Feuerback especially is pretty much on the out these days. You want to be thinking of these guys more as disposable close-in assault pieces as part of teams that will be moving up the field. A team of your gunfighter of choice and a Dartok and a Kaitox Shock Regiment is still a very clean multi-role offensive and defensive Haris. But you can also find yourself, particularly if you're trying to be very clean with your use of troop slots, cutting the Kaitox in order to get more elements spread across the battlefield and not as concentrated in Link teams. Overall, still a very good option, particularly the chain rifle, but be a bit more judicious with taking them this edition. Another piece that is still viable and good, but which I find myself using less these days, is the Surriat Assault Heavy Infantry. Now, these guys used to be staples. I would generally take these, particularly the Heavy Rocket Launcher, but also sometimes the Tactical Awareness HMG profiles, kind of as my gunfighters of choice. But as the options available to the Morat Aggression Force have widened, and what constitutes good gunfighting has shifted, and in particular as Link team bonuses have changed, I have found the Surriats have dropped off a little bit. If you want to run the pseudo-invincible army door-kicking heavy infantry link, they are still what you'll be reaching for, because it's how you get access to tactical awareness and tin bots in a big heavy infantry fire team backed up by like 14 orders. But I have shifted away from them as active turn gunfighting pieces because they can no longer get access to Ballistic Skill 16 from full link team bonuses. If you want to play the game of ignoring enemy modifiers, you're kind of limited to just the MSV1 heavy rocket launcher, or you're hoping to just throw a ton of dice downrange with the HMG, and the cost of those when you're kind of gated to just Ballistic Skill 13 without any really significant ability to impose negative mods on the enemy, feels a little bit more limited than it used to be. When we get to the showcase list at the end of this video, you'll kind of see what I mean, but the main culprit for me for the demise of the Surriat has been the Yaoat. Now, this represents a significant change from N4, when Yaogats were used, but they were just used kind of occasionally as a complement alongside things like the Surriat. In N5, I am leaning toward the Yaoat more and more as my preferred gunfighters. And the reason for that is that Morat Aggression Force has an absolute ton of smoke. You have basically trivial access to as much as you could ever want in any given list very easily, because the pieces we have that are packing smoke grenades are ubiquitously really cool pieces. And by capitalizing on that with a Yaoat, you get MSV2 smoke shooting. And smoke shooting is just better in N5 than it was in N4, because it is much harder to access abilities that let you ignore the penalties from being shot through smoke, right? Link teams do not play to 5 troopers as often as they used to. Smaller 2 and 3 and 4 person link teams are more common. It is quite reliable to get smoke shooting penalties imposed on your opponent, and at that point the Yaoat, its odds of winning a face-to-face roll and doing damage are just better than the Surriat. It is just better at winning gunfights. It ignores more enemy modifiers, it imposes more penalties on your opponent, and that collectively comfortably compensates for the fact that it is a single wound trooper, right? And the Surriat is a multi-wound trooper. Now, it is basically only gunfighting that I use the Yaoat for. I don't take the combi rifle Panzerfaust. I definitely don't take the boarding shotgun Panzerfaust. Kind of a cool concept. These are only 21 points, but it is the multi-sniper rifle +1 burst and the Spitfire that are the two go-tos here. The Spitfire for a more active turn-oriented, move up the board kind of piece, and the multi-sniper rifle for a more combat group 2, hang back, do long-range support fire, but mix and match based on the needs of the scenario. If you're playing provisioning, for example, you are more likely to want multiple snipers because of the very long range bands that scenario can impose. In other scenarios, you may want a mix. Double Yaoat is actually quite common in many of my lists these days, with the basic goal being my gunfighting in active turn will always either be taking aggressive advantage of smoke shooting or aggressive advantage of my own ballistic skill attack -3 gunfighting to always impose negatives on my opponent to compensate for the fact that my army is primarily ballistic skill 12 and 13. It's something that I have found works very well. You do have to consider how you're going to handle force reconstitution if the Yaogats go down. Armor 3 BTS 3 is quite nice, but it is just 1 wound. But we have access to Speedball, and you will usually be finding that your command tokens are free enough to have Speedballs available. That takes care of one instance of a Yaoat dropping down, and I'm also using things like Rendacs more often, which leads us to the Rendac Emergency Brigade. Now, I will confess I've only used one of these profiles in N5, and that is the FTO Paramedic, but I have used it a bunch, and it is probably the largest culprit in why Kaitox shock regiments are being forced out of my lists. Now, in terms of being a close assault piece, it's not really any parallel. The Kaitox is just better. But the Rendac for, 5 more points, accompanies a link team very well and is just an enormous pile of utility, which means that if you can find the points, and finding the points usually starts with cutting the Kaitox, you get a really cool pile of rules. Firstly, it's just durable. It's armor 3, BTS 3, it's shock immune, critical immune, and has no wound incapacitation. And just for clarity, when I say it's shock immune, I mean it has the structure attribute, so shock has no effect against it. It is a specialist because it is a paramedic with good movement and climbing plus, which means it can reach objectives that might otherwise be difficult on certain weird tables. It also has a sensor, which is just randomly extremely useful some of the time. It has a +1 burst medikit, which actually works very nicely in Morats. Almost all Morat troops have a natively high Fizz score. Even Yaogats are sitting at Fizz 12. And if a Rendac is linked, noting that the Rendac does not have the Morat keyword, just as a note, but if a Rendac is linked, it will be rolling 2 dice +1 special die with the medkit, which gives it a really good chance of rolling 2 hits with a medikit. You only need to succeed one of those for your model to be recovered, which makes the Rendac really good at recovering things like downed Datarazzi or downed Yaogats or whatever might have fallen over meaning it's really good force reconstitution on top of everything else. Finally, dodge +3 and dodge -3 actually makes it hilariously difficult to pin down. If you have a Rendac in a position where your opponent is like, I have to dislodge that in order to proceed up the board, you can toilet bowl entire turns by having it dodge on 16s. Your opponent has a -3 on any roll against the Rendac, which by the by Warhorse does not ignore. I have sapped 3, 4, 5 orders from opponents in different games before the Rendac finally dodges into total cover. All of that makes it a really cool piece that I've had a lot of fun using, but finding 24 points is not trivial, and it usually means cutting something a little bit important. For me, that has been the Kaitox, because I really like my hackers, but if you wanted to run just a little bit more hacking light, you could also trim maybe one Dartok out of a list and fit a Rendac in that way. Either way, I do recommend them. Maybe not in every single list, but it's something to be aware of. They're a very fun piece to use. Now, just to round out the Morat fire team, just a couple more things. We won't cover every single model that can join it, but we will cover Tritak Anyat. Now, Anyat is a model that I have not personally used at all in N5, because for 24 points, I could get a Rendac Emergency Brigade, and I really like those. But there is something to be said for having a specialist operative with smoke grenades in a fire team. Now, Morats have got lots of access to smoke. I will be putting Datarazzi, I will be putting Osnats in my lists, but sometimes there is no substitute for having smoke right there in the link team that is moving forward, and so you can give some consideration to Anyat. On top of that, a K1 combi rifle, if you get it into the right range bands, does give you some nice tech against certain enemy targets. She's by no means bad, it's just that 24 points competes with one or two pieces that I really, really like, whereas I just think she's kind of okay. I also want to give a very honorable mention to the Yaoat Killing Platoon, which is not a piece that I have yet been able to comfortably fit into a list, but I think it is finally at a point where it deserves a look in. Now, people were taking these in N4, and I never really figured out why, but in N5 they make sense. They are a little bit expensive, the weapons are a little bit awkward, but Ballistic Skill 13 is actually kind of high by the standards of Morats, and they have Mimetism -3 and Ballistic Skill Attack +1 special die, and those are just really, really good rules. Technically, they also have CC Attack -3. I don't particularly care about that. What I am interested in is the fact that they are firing armor-piercing T2 rounds with many dice and Mimetism and Ballistic Skill 13. That is actually kind of enough at this stage to make up for the fact that the weapon loadouts are a little bit weird and anemic. The AP Marksman Rifle, the cheap AP Submachine Gun, and the MSV2 AP Submachine Gun are all at least theoretically worth a look in. My gut instinct is to reach toward the Marksman Rifle, but I actually think it might just be taking the AP Submachine Gun and using it as kind of a gunfighting close assault piece, as a substitute for a piece like a Kaitox, for example, yet again a piece that displaces Kaitox from lists, is worth consideration. You can even theoretically just drop them out of links and into suppressive fire, because all of their rules work very well with that as a rule. Either way, these are guys that deserve a lot more consideration than I gave them in the previous edition, now that it's N5. Now, that's the Morat fire team covered. On to the next fire team, and one which has emerged as one of my favorites of the edition, which is the Rodok Armed Imposition Detachment fire team. Now, these guys will always be run basically just as a Haris team. You can run them as a duo, but Haris team is very strongly recommended because of the different models that can join it. Usually you'll run two Rodok and a Crackhead, and I'll talk about the Crackhead immediately after this. Now, the Rodok themselves, once again, very Ballistic Skill 12, but they have Mimetism and Armor 3 and BTS 6, and they have Super Jump 3 inches, which means that they move 7 inches on a Super Jump and can move 11 inches in an order by Super Jumping and then moving. That is a lot of mobility, and the Crackhead keeps up with them easily, which gives you a fire team which, when it is go time, can move forward and get angles with like a lot of speed. 7 inches of movement and an action, or 11 inches of movement just in terms of straight line distance covered, is really fast. And because I have found that I run slightly smaller order counts with Morats than I used to, that's something that I value. But also just bouncy boys are really fun in this particular context. Using them and making those long jumps and getting around the table is really cool. Now, the jumping castle effect on its own would not be enough to make me recommend them, but there are a couple of profiles in here that are really, really interesting in the context of the broader faction, and especially of our ability to run a lot more SWC flexibility than we used to. The first of those is the Thunderbolt +1 burst profile. Now, that's going to be a burst 3 Thunderbolt +1 special die if you're appropriately linked. At Ballistic Skill 12 with Mimetism, that's 4 dice on 12s with Mimetism -3. That's basically fine. You do want to pick your gunfights with that, right? That's really just a long range, like that's kind of just a Mim 3 Ballistic Skill 12 HMG at that point. You don't want to use that to fight into anything that will ignore your modifiers or which you can't hurt with a Thunderbolt, but it is a 0 SWC weapon with long range and high enough burst, which means that finding a good angle using your speed and your super jumping, you can get payoff from strange angles that come from being able to jump 7 inches with a piece like the Thunderbolt. Now, if you wanted to upgun the link, you could spend a bunch of points in SWC to get a Spitfire or even a missile launcher, but for me it's the 0 SWC Thunderbolt that I reach for the most, with the Spitfire being kind of a minor consideration. The other profile that is really, really interesting is the Hacker. Now, just natively, this guy has all of the rest of the Rodok stuff, which means that he's a jumpy boy with a boarding shotgun and being able to move a long way and then fire a boarding shotgun with Ballistic Skill 12 and a Mimetism and the special die. That boarding shotgun can just do work by itself. But the other thing about this guy is that he is a 0 SWC, Willpower 13, Warhorse, BTS 6, Hacker with Trinity, and Combat Instinct. Combat Instinct means he ignores stealth, and so it is in the Rodok that we see the final thing rounding out what makes Morat Info War just so complete for relatively few points and SWC. If you run 1 or 2 Datox, you have decent hackers and network projection to fire out your pitches. And with the Rodok Hacker, you have yet another hacker who can do both hacking and Trinity, and you have a Combat Instinct hacker to ignore stealth. That collectively ticks every single box you need to tick to just be a good hacking faction in N5, and Morats are doing it without really having to flex the rest of their army too much or even pay particularly many SWC. That is really cool and really interesting, and it makes the fire team of a Morat Rodok Thunderbolt and a Rodok Hacker really nice even before we add the Crackhead to it. But we are absolutely going to add the Crackhead to it. Now, Crackhead Renegades are a regiment with kind of a storied history. They were one of the very first ITS exclusive model mercenaries that came out and you could get if you won an ITS pack, and they were broken as hell when they were released relative to the state of the game, and so everyone wanted 2 of them, and so you had to try and fight blah 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 blah. These days, Crackhots are relatively well balanced, but very cool under the right circumstances. And in Morats, that right circumstance is as part of a Rodok fire team. Now, they don't contribute to the fire team for bonuses because it's only Rodok that will give you the 2 Rodok models. You could theoretically do a very aggressive double Crackhead single Rodok list, but a fire team, but I don't think I recommend that. You could theoretically also just do a double Crackhead team, but also don't think I recommend that. I like 2 Rodok and a Crackhead, but they do benefit from that special die, and there's just a ton of stuff here that adds up to a really capable close assault piece. They have 6-2 move with super jump, which means that they will move 8 inches on their super jump and then 2 inches otherwise. They have Berserk +3, which you will want to use in order to make close combat fights in your favor. That gets you up to CC 23, which is good enough to generally win a lot of face-to-face rolls. You can theoretically get that even higher with chest mines if you want to use chest mines rather than your DA CCW in close combat. They have native forward deployment that can join the link team anyway, so you'll want to consider that when you're doing your fire team deployment. They have metachemistry reroll. Metachemistry is a really solid skill in N5, and reroll means you should basically always be able to find something that's kind of cool and interesting. And then usually we will take just the 14-point profile because it has ballistic skill attack +1 burst, which means that if we're not coming around a corner into close combat, we have the option of forking either 2 templates with the chain rifle, or 4 dice with the heavy pistol, or 3 dice with the grenades. Now, if you're thinking, really, grenades as a face-to-face roll? Let me remind you, we have metachemistry reroll. If you roll up +3 fizz or +3 fizz and regeneration, the Crackhead is going to be fizz 16, which means that if it comes around a corner in good range, it can roll 2 dice +1 special die on 19s, throwing those grenades at people. That's a really good face-to-face roll. 3 dice on 19s is not something people will find easily, and it's a template weapon. Now, unless your metachemistry roll gives you something that is a resiliency effect, so regeneration is kind of one thing, but more no wound, incapacitation, or dogged, then the Crackot will be making one-way trips quite a lot of the time. But since you get him forward and into position whenever you start activating the Rodok fire team, he makes just a really good element to detach off and make an assault with, or collapse in on and punish anything that tries to attack the Rodok. He's 14 points. He is only 14 points. He is very cheap. He is regular. He joins a Rodok link really nicely and adds just a ton of danger to that fire team. And so he's part of a team that has become one of my favorites to use in N5. Very strong recommend. Don't really recommend using any of the other options. It's really just the 14.1 that does everything that you need, but an extremely cool piece to use. Now, we're going to just briefly segue kind of, I guess, through the fire team section to talk about lieutenant options just briefly, because I feel like we need to talk about that now. We've talked about the primary link teams that we'll be using in Morats for like workhorse work, but also because the lieutenant options have kind of changed in a very interesting way in N5. Now, Cornac Gazarot remains a really solid lieutenant. If you run him, you will usually run the 42-point +1 order Strategos profile. He's tough, he's dangerous, he's fairly good in close combat. He's one of only 2 models with Ballistic Skill 14 in the entire faction, and the only linkable Ballistic Skill 14 model. A Mark 12 is a fine weapon. You get just generally a solid and well-rounded piece, if a little bit expensive for your points cost, and 2 regular orders thanks to Strategos and Lieutenant +1 order. In almost any other faction, he would be an absolute snap pick, and he was an absolute snap pick in Morats for the entirety of the 2 previous editions. But in N5, all of a sudden he actually has some really, really stiff competition. And that competition takes the form of the Soarat Tempest regiment. Now, first and notable downside for these guys, good luck finding the miniatures. These guys really need to be on Corvus Belly's release list because you just can't find them for love or money anymore. The only sculpts that exist are old school pre-rework sculpts, and although those are really nice miniatures, and the one that I use, the Morat Aggression Forces aesthetic changed a little bit with the rework and the re-release of their sculpts. Corvus Belly really needs to drop 1 or 2 new sculpts for these guys because they are finding their way into lists in a big way. Now, they were never exactly bad in previous editions, but they were kind of just a big pile of stats. They didn't have any significant visual modifier. They weren't great at winning gunfights. They were just durable, like tag level durability, just about light tag level durability, and not a lot else was going for them. You might use them, but you really wouldn't. That has changed in a big way in this edition. The weapons and the durability have all stayed the same. We have a choice of AP HMGs or Fweback +1 bursts, and they are still an absolute chonker at Arm 6, BTS 6, 2 Vitality with no wound incap and shock immunity. But now, in addition to Warhorse giving them immunity to Ballistic Skill Attack -3, they have Ballistic Skill Attack -3 themselves, making them actually capable gunfighters. In addition, they are the only access we have to disco balls in the entire faction, making them a key part of any visibility control game. And they are very good at placing those disco balls, potentially over multiple turns if you need to, thanks to our excellent access to baggage in Morat Aggression Force. And if all of that wasn't enough, the lieutenant profiles have, especially in the case of the Fweback, sharp SWC discounts. Paying only half an SWC for that Fweback +1 burst Disco Baller Soarat Tempest Regiment Lieutenant is an absolute steal, and basically guarantees, particularly with the existence of things like Rodok's Fire Team, that you can just completely be flexible in terms of how you spend your SWC in Morats now, where we used to be extremely constrained in terms of just have to be very judicious, being really careful about taking any hackers because any hackers would mean that we didn't have enough SWC for a 4th gun, all that kind of stuff, a thing of the past. With the Soarat Tempest Regiment, you not only get one of the best active turn lieutenants in the game in a faction that just casually allows you to play active turn lieutenants with 0 risk. But you also get a very credible, very durable, reasonably costed heavy weapon platform and some visibility control at a low enough SWC cost to just make SWC a breeze. These add up a lot, and basically every single Morat list I have written since the first time I tried one of these has included the Lieutenant Feuerback. Now, I lean toward the Feuerback Lieutenant over the APHMG Lieutenant, even though they are the exact same cost, because a Feuerback +1 burst is a better weapon than an APHMG. It's one less burst, but if it hits, it is significantly more dangerous. The reason why they are the same cost is that the HMG is paying for Lieutenant +1 command token, and Morats just don't need command tokens. Now, if you do want an APHMG, my recommendation is take the Lieutenant Feuerback +1 burst, and then take the NCO AP Heavy Machine Gun, and link them, because you can duo these guys. And as far as both active and reactive turn fire bases go, that is a hell of an active and reactive turn firebase. The way that the rest of the Morat Aggression Force is structured, you will need to make some very limited compromises to get a Soarat duo into a list, but you absolutely can get a Soarat duo into a list and still reasonably comfortably hit 15 troopers, 15 regular orders. I like these guys a lot. I very strongly recommend them as your lieutenant. It was always going to take a lot to dislodge Cornac from his position as just about auto-include LT in a Morat Aggression Force list, but the Soarat Tempest Regiment has basically done it. These guys are all-stars, and if you can find a damn model for one, you should take them in lists. Now, technically, we haven't spoken about a single unlinkable model yet, and as we proceed on into the warband section, that trend will continue as we get to Datarazzi Witch Soldiers, who are, in addition to being warbands, also linkable. Now, linking them is pretty optional. I find that I will usually take one or two in a list. The second one has been displaced in lists occasionally these days, mostly just to fit the Crackhead Renegade for a Rodok team. But even when I'm taking multiples, usually I won't link them because I want smoke that they provide on different parts of the table and to take advantage of their impetuous activations. Either way, mileage may vary. The 14-point profile in particular is just one of the best warbands in the entire game. There's really no other way to dress that up. They have Fizz 14 smoke, they have a chain rifle +1 burst and grenades, Fizz 14 for spec fire if you need it, and a heavy pistol, meaning that at short range they can fork an ARO between the chain rifle and the heavy pistol. They even have mimetism, because why not? And they have the highest damage output of basically any warband trooper in the entire game, with a whopping CC23 Martial Arts level 4, so a true 2-dice attack, and a damage 4 DACW. It is entirely possible for these guys to inflict 6 saves at damage 4 on an enemy that they get into contact with, meaning that a single Datarazzi can blow through even a heavily armored tag in an order or two if it just gets into close combat, and because it has smoke, it can get into close combat relatively reliably. Now, they aren't fast, they are just 4/4 move, so sending a Datarazzi into close combat usually means either having staged it aggressively in a previous turn, or putting a bunch of orders into it, or both. But the payoff for making close combat with these guys is extreme. They're just really, really good. You should probably always include one of in a list just because of the value of smoke, especially if you're running Yaoats as active fire team members. But even just on their own merits, they are one of the most dangerous 4-cost pieces in the entire game. You have to get them into close combat or into close assault positions, but even if you don't, 14 points for a regular order is not the worst price to pay in the game. Just outstanding pieces, and they really don't need much more talking about. Now, a little more technical is the Osnat Morat Hunting Regiment. There is a synchronized Preta option coming in at 25 points, which is a fun but very expensive piece, usually a bit of a vanity pick, not recommended as a baseline choice, but both of the other Osnat FTOs as Fireteam Masters for Hungries, that is, Gakis and Pretas, turns very cheap irregular orders into regular troopers, in addition to getting the benefit of fireteam bonuses if you have the right number of those pieces. Now, just as a quick rules note, the Hungries are referred to as the Hungries in, for example, the fireteam rule, and in each of their regiments, but in the Hungries fireteam lineup, it does break Gakis and Preta into separate troops, so my assumption and how I have been playing it this edition is that to get a fireteam bonus, you need 2 Gakis or 2 Pretas. You can't mix and match. Just bear that in mind when you are doing your Fireteam setups. Now, which Osnat you pick is basically going to just come down to, firstly, how many points you have to spare on the Link team, but also what you're looking to do with it. One option, which is totally reasonable, is the 15-point Smoke Grenade Launcher with just 2 Gakis. That comes in at 23 points for 3 regular orders, and in that setup, what you're basically going to be doing is using the Osnat just for long range 2 dice on 11's smoke grenades to get smoke just wherever you need it. It's very cheap, it gets you a bunch of regular orders, it provides smoke support for your MSV pieces, reasonable, sensible, hangs out in the rear with the gear and doesn't do much more. You can also choose to run these guys with a bit more of an assault bent because Hungries are very fast and Osnat are very fast, and so you do have that option for moving these up a little bit more aggressively. Osnat are not natively massively great in close combat, just CC21 at Martial Arts level 1, but if you have, for example, an Osnat and 2 Hungries run into close combat together under smoke, then all of a sudden that Osnat is burst 3 and actually really dangerous in close combat. And so in that slightly more aggressive case, you would probably consider shifting to the 17-point Osnat, not because the smoke grenades versus the smoke grenade launcher is fantastic, or that you really want to use the Vulcan shotgun, but just because it has a DA rather than shock CCW. You do need that extra damage to really make her into a melee regiment that is worth using, and it's only a couple of extra points. Now, in terms of the Hungries themselves, we have Gakis, which are pure melee. Both of them are Climbing Plus, both of them are 6/6. Gakis explode. CC20, but with no martial arts skills, means that they're actually not very good in close combat. Really, you mostly want to be using these guys just for 2 things. Option 1, in a fire team, just being a regular order for 4 points. Option 2, you can use these as free-running assault pieces, not exactly to attempt to do any damage, although explode sometimes will take something out, but mostly just to run forward 12 inches in the impetuous phase, and then use their irregular order to move another 12 inches and just detonate every mine in their path. No subtlety, just face check like your Ariad and opponent's minefield, blow through all of that, figure out what's real and what's not, and then having spent the 4 points and the troop slot, move on to play the rest of the game normally. That's something that you can consider doing in any situation where you have the Osnat Link team, or you can just dedicate a 4 point. If you've got the point spare and you don't want to take a war correspondent, which we have access to in Morats this season, just remember that the Gaki has that use case. Now, the Preta is more expensive, but it has an actual template weapon in the form of the chain rifle, and it has Dogged, which makes it reasonable enough as something like a corner guard, and is not a bad outlet for points if you're looking to upgrade Gakis in your Osnat team. Just remember that you need 2 of the same type of Hungry to benefit from Fireteam bonuses, and so if you're taking the kind of like minimum entry Osnat and 2 Hungries, you would need to upgrade 2 Gakis into 2 Pretas to maintain the Fireteam bonuses on the Osnat. That's fine, and you can do that, just bear that in mind as a cost. Now, 52 minutes in, we will finally stop talking about things that are linkable, and well, maybe some will be linkable, and just run through a couple of the other things that are worth at least remembering exists in the Morat Aggression Force. That sounds like damning with faint praise, but actually Rasiat diplomatic divisions are really, really good. Parachutist Deployment Zone is an awesome skill, and basically every Rasiat profile can capitalize on that really nicely. They are just good enough in close combat to be very dangerous, particularly against enemy non-experts. They have jet propulsion, super jump, and stealth, and eclipse grenades, so they can get into close combat really easily. And if you have the points and SWC spare, you can take a Spitfire profile and just turn up off of the back table edge and hose down things facing the wrong direction in the midfield. Spitfires on parachutist and combat jump troops, in my experience, have the perfect range bands, especially when combined with the mobility in 3 dimensions of jet propulsion, to get absolutely killer angles into things your opponents hope you would not see. And so if you have the points in SWC, and these days you will usually have the SWC in Morats, the Spitfire is a very worthwhile upgrade. But even the 25-point profile just turning up to shank people is an absolute nightmare, to say nothing of its utility in scenarios like Mindwipe, for example, where access to the D-charges and DACCW, the anti-materiel options, can be really, really powerful. So Rasiat's little bit of a tech pick even in Morats, because your opponent will always know that there's like something amiss when you take just 14 troops in your regular deployment. Very good, very dangerous, have only gotten better thanks to changes to both martial arts and super jump. Very strong and fun piece. Now, from there, we'll talk about the only true infiltrator in Morat Aggression Force. There are some forward deployment options that are totally fine, for example, the Crackhead and the Rendac. But if you want a true infiltrator, and there are some scenarios where that's quite useful, particularly the new provisioning scenario, the Surriat is what you've got. Now, the Surriat commits the worst sin that you can commit for an infiltrating piece, which is that she doesn't have access to a marker state, which means she is very vulnerable, which she makes up for by having Mimetism -6. Now, I would strongly advise against any of the hacker profiles here. Being a hacker just means that your opponent has a way of attacking you that circumvents that mimetism. But the forward observer profile, I think in particular, is interesting. That boarding shotgun +1 burst can be very difficult to beat in a face-to-face roll if it's coming at you in the active turn. And if we're talking about infiltrators, we're probably talking about provisioning. And if we're playing provisioning, a forward observer bonus is very relevant. Now, the more ranged-oriented profiles, the combi rifle, the marksman rifle, you can consider, but my personal take is that Ballistic Skill 11 really does fall into the point where, unless you have a lot of dice being thrown down range, that's a bit of a challenge to win face-to-face rolls with. The mine layer you could also consider. 22 points really is not that expensive, even if it is only a paramine, because sometimes a paramine is all you need to just dissuade your opponent from walking over an objective. For my money, though, the most interesting profile is the Forward Observer, specifically in those few missions that have Forward Observer bonuses, or perhaps as part of a plan to support her with smoke, perhaps from an Osnat downrange or a Datarazzi moving up the field, to get across any gaps where she might otherwise be shot and hit the opponent's deployment zone, at which point Ballistic Skill 11 coming around a corner is rolling 17s with that shotgun, and Mimetism on the way back is protecting her in those face-to-face rolls. Next up, we have our second drop troop / parachutist, the Dropsuit Tariot, who is frankly just a weird little guy. I actually think much of the time, despite the combat jump explosion, you will probably want to consider having this guy arrive via parachutist, but frankly, at 16 to 18 points, he's also cheap enough that if you just YOLO it and try and roll the 12, well, if he succeeds, maybe he's in a good position. Now, despite the paramedic profile, which you could potentially use as a specialist in some scenarios, mostly what this guy is the definition of a one-way trip piece. 6-2 move with super jump gives him a long leash on aggressive moves, and any of these profiles is packing a boarding pistol, which means you threaten a template hit with a model that has dogged. Now, whether you're running the heavy shotgun, the AP SMG, or the adhesive launcher profile, +1 burst, ballistic skill attack, that's kind of weird because there is no ability to actually fork the ARO with the cheapest dropsuit Tariat, because you are either firing non-lethal rounds or a burst 2 template, but any of them can theoretically run in, land, go dogged, make kind of a mess. I think I favor one of the 18-point pieces just for the lethal non-template weapon. But really, whatever the goal you're setting is to just arrive with an 18-point piece and use that mobility, template, dogged, and super jump just to do some damage before it expires. It's kind of a weird choice. I don't think I would ever come close to fielding the max AVA. But with especially the way that super jump currently works in the game, they are at least worth exploring because of how much reach they have on a per order basis to do some damage. Now, finally, briefly to talk about the tactical armored gears in the Morat Aggression Force. The Morat Aggression Force has one tag, the Raicho Armored Brigade, and one reading comprehension test, the Bulltrike Mobile Regiment, and frankly, both of them have kind of been obsoleted a little bit by the Soarat Tempest Regiment. A Soarat is relatively cost efficient, but it is still north of 50 points, and taking a Soarat as your lieutenant often means that points for something like a Raicho, for example, are beginning to get a little bit thin on the ground. You can write lists that have, for example, 2 Soarats, but a Soarat and a Raicho, while possible, is a bit more of a hard ask. Now, despite that, I don't mind the Raicho. It's a little bit expensive, but ultimately a totally serviceable tag. Any of the profiles is theoretically viable, with the 81-point deluxe version being kind of the most exciting. But we are talking an awful lot of points for a piece at that point. I have not used the Raicho at all this edition. I have certainly not used the Bull Track. But a tag with Warhorse is at least theoretically still a very cool piece, and so there is probably a list out there somewhere for which one of the Raicho profiles works. Now, the Bull Track, by comparison, is Armor 5. Moving on. Now, this is my current go-to list with the Morat Aggression Force in N5, although it's just one of the different options you might possibly take. It does have a bunch of the things that I most like about them in this edition, and it shows off a bunch of the things I've been talking about over the course of this video. Now, this list grew out of an experiment in seeing how many SWC style guns I could put into a list and still get a complete hacking package. And what I found is I can get a complete hacking package and guided missiles and still have 4 proper long range guns in a list, which is just really, really cool. Now, notwithstanding that this is a list with guided missiles, my strong recommendation is that you don't try and make active turn guided missile plays. Your hackers are willpower 13. Guided missiles are very inconsistent. A successful reset against the attack by the guided missile sets you back to square one, and trying to land even burst to spotlight rolls, it just takes too long and doesn't accomplish anything. Unless you are playing in a very specific situation where you go, I don't want to advance, I want to just make my opponent's life kind of miserable, and there are situations where that is the thing to do, don't go for active turn missile plays, but spew out repeaters so that reactive turn spotlights are a threat your opponent can't ignore. So we are starting with the Rodok fire team that I mentioned. Rodok Thunderbolt, Rodok Hacker, Crackhead Renegade. These guys have just done absolute work. They are a piece that you could cut if you wanted to flex into other things in the list. They're a little bit of a luxury pick, but I've enjoyed them sufficiently that I really like playing with them, and they have always performed basically well. They tend to die because they are single wound infantry, but I have never had a game with them where they have not done something cool and valuable. We then have a 3-person fire team, so this is our second Haris team, of a Spitfire Yaoat, a Dartok FTO, and a Rendac FTO paramedic. Now, if you want to get a heavy infantry into this list, if the idea of a Yaoat Spitfire doesn't quite tickle your pickle, then you can cut both the Yaoat and the Rendac for a Kaitox Shock Regiment and a Surriat HRL. That was what was originally in this list before I played it a bunch of times and found that the Surriat was just not something I ever wanted to take a gunfight with, and I wanted a Rendac, and so that change neatly gets 2 things in. The Yaoat, which I will absolutely take a gunfight with, because 5 dice on 12s through smoke is quite solid, and the Rendac has just been useful game after game. We then have the T-Drone, which we can afford in terms of SWC, despite the fact that this list has 4 big guns in it and 3 hackers, which is just an obscene amount of SWC spend equivalent that no other faction can match. We then have an Osnat FTO and 2 Gakis. This is the cheapest version of this fire team, where the real only goal of the Osnat is just to fire off smoke grenades at long range for pieces that need it. There are multiple MSV2 pieces in this list, and because of the inclusion of things like the guided missile and the Crackhead Renegade in the Rodok fire team, I need access to that smoke, and there are actually only so many smoke grenade throws otherwise. There's just a single Datarazzi. So the Osnat is very important as an enabler for the Yaogats, and she's pretty much dedicated to that role. In Combat Group 2 then, we have a duo of a Yaoat multi-sniper and a Dartok FTO. These guys just hang out in the rear with the gear, usually near the Icadron, so that the Dartok rather, can reload. The Yaoat just takes really long range, 4 dice sniper rifle attacks through smoke. One of the things I was finding before I included the Yaoat Spitfire was that the sniper rifle Yaoat had to do just way too much work and was often overstressed trying to actually accomplish all of the things I needed. With 2 Yaogats and the Soarat and the Rodok, I basically always have gunfighting where I need it. We then have the Soarat Lieutenant. He will also try and deploy where possible near the Icadron for reloads to the Disco Ball if I find I need it, but there's also enough firepower coming out of this list that I can often just gunfight my way forward. Finally, as noted, we have an Icadron for the reloads, and then a Datarazzi. Datarazzi are very, very good and provide smoke for the Yaoat, so I'm not wholly contingent just on the Osnat. Now, if you wanted to flex this list, as noted, you can adjust the Yaoat Spitfire team to include a Surriat heavy rocket launcher. And you can also absolutely trim the Rodok down. The Crackhead in that case can just become a Datarazzi, and that frees up a bunch of points for other kind of 20 to 30 point equivalent luxury pieces. That's where you start getting things like Zerats or more likely Rasiats into a list. And you can even accommodate a Rasiat fairly easily if you cut the T-Drone to give you the SWC for the Rasiat Spitfire. That's another way to make great use of the SWC that this list has to play with, where you get to keep, in that case, 3 SWC equivalent guns and still have hackers, and then have a Parachutes Deployment Zone Spitfire. This list has performed very well, very consistently for me across multiple games in this edition, and I've enjoyed it an absolute ton. Now, just to show off a secondary list that is a bit more experimental, this list was me cooking a fair bit, actually, trying to see what a double Soarat list looks like, still getting all of the other guns that I want into the list. And so there are a few things in here that are experimental, and I have not played it yet, but it is on my list of things to play. And we start with a Soarat duo, so the NCO, APHMG, and the Lieutenant Feuerback, exactly as noted. We then have two Datarazzi who could be linked, but will mostly probably be free running. However, to note, if you choose to link the Datarazzi, then this list begins with 14 out of 15 troops linked, which is very funny. We then have a Yaoat Spitfire and a Dartok, just as a duo. So we have duo and potential duo and then duo. No Rendac in this case, which means we are contingent on Speedball if anyone goes down, but it's the same gunfighting as before. Then we have the first of two Hungary's fire teams. So the first of those is the Vulcan shotgun and two Predators. The intention here is actually for these to be making close assault attacks in some games. Datarazzi will impetuous to throw smoke. This fire team will impetuous forward really aggressively and then relink, and then shoot off to make a mess of the enemy, looking to get into close combat under smoke, or even just, attack with Praetors and stuff. We then have an Icadron, the sole unlinked model in the list, but we have a lot of things that can reload. We have disco balls and multiple pitches, so the Icadron is very valuable. Finally, we have the Yaoat and the Dartok, same as before, and then a support Osnat team. These can still go into close combat, etc., but the goal here is more just to have these guys dedicated to laying down smoke for the Yaogats or for the other teams. You lay down smoke with your group 2 so that your group 1 can spend the maximum number of orders advancing. And so the list has a very clean division between an enabling group 2 that lays smoke for the attacks and smoke for the movement, and then a little bit of fire support with the Yaoat, and then an active group 1 that wants to yeet up the table. Now, obviously, this list has two specialists. You don't want to be playing this in any scenario that is like very specialist intensive, but counterpoint, it has two Surriats and just a whole bunch of other stuff being really, really aggressive. This is an example of the kind of list that I might play in Biotech 4, for example, since it can very easily get everyone out of the Biotech 4 zone. In that kind of a game, I would give strong consideration to actually having the Surriats as ARO pieces on turn 1, because your opponent trying to advance under gunfire from the Surriats in Biotech 4 sounds nightmarish. And then on your turn, all of this should move very cleanly into the safe zone, but you can adopt very similar practices basically on any mission that allows mostly a focus on attacking, things like decapitation, for example. You could probably even play this in a scenario like Supremacy, where you need to press buttons, but you get a hacking bonus, and you don't have to worry about contesting them later in the game. It's more about points in zones. This is an experimental list, but it is just a bit of a showcase in what you can do if you want to fit double Surriat in, and still get a bunch of the other toys that Morats can use. Now, that wraps this video up. Hope very much that you've enjoyed it. Just a quick channel plug as usual to close out. If you like the video, please consider hitting the like button and subscribing on YouTube. It does help the channel out, or so I'm told. If you'd like to support the channel directly, you can do so either via the Buy Me a Coffee link in the video description, or by becoming a channel member on YouTube. Big thanks to everyone who has. We'll be back next week, as always, with more wargaming content, primarily Infinity. I hope very much that you've enjoyed this, and I will see you next time.